Many European attendees of this year's Munich Security Conference very likely psyched themselves up as they collected their laminates by reassuring themselves that it could hardly go worse than last year's. At the 2025 Munich Security Conference, held just a few weeks after US President Donald Trump was sworn back in, US Vice President JD Vance delivered a speech apparently designed to uphold every negative stereotype ever nurtured by fancy-pants, hoity-toity Europeans of the boorish, tactless, and graceless American abroad. Many left Munich 2025 assuming that the transatlantic alliance, as they had come to understand it over the previous 80 years, was finished. Vance did not come to Munich 2026, held as always at the Hotel Bayerischer Hof in the heart of the city, where the merest rev of an American motorcade is likely to bring several surrounding blocks to a standstill. The US delegation was led instead by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was somewhat more polite than Vance, but bore an ultimately similar message, that the US is weary of defending what it increasingly sees as an idle, decadent, and trivial continent. Also hanging over proceedings was the looming fourth anniversary of Russia's full-scale assault upon Ukraine, and the prospect of the US conniving in rewarding Russia for its folly. So too was the United States' recent threats against Greenland, part of the Kingdom of Denmark, a fellow NATO member, and President Trump's sneering disparagement of the sacrifices made by all NATO members in America's 21st century wars. As Monocle's team hustled between interview locations inside and on top of the Bayerischer Hof, an adjacent bank repurposed as a temporary Ukrainian embassy, a helpful Italian cafe across the street, and a rain-swept footpath by the security perimeter, we were, as usual at Munich, not short of talking points. How much damage has been done to the transatlantic alliance? Can and or should the US still be trusted at all? And how has NATO coped with the prospect of war within itself? This is the Foreign Desk.
So what is a European manifesto? What is a European version of transatlantic relationship?
We want to see a sovereign, independent, secure European Ukraine.
There's many of us who also see and realise that actually the United States is and has been a partner to Europe, not actually out of choice, but out of necessity to both of us.
The way forward is really about European allies and Canada in NATO taking the lead.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest on this special edition of The Foreign Desk is Gabrielius Landsbergis, former Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs, currently a visiting fellow at Stanford University. Gabrielius joined us at the glamorous location of a corner of footpath just inside the security perimeter, just as Munich's February weather began to turn on us. I began by asking him, very much not for the first time, if he thought the reality of Europe's position had sunk in yet.
It's starting to sink in.
So it's only taken 4 years.
It's only taken, 4 years. But it's, after the transatlantic alliance has been created, when? That's been decades after, that, so rearranging it, or thinking anew, or it takes a while. So, I can a bit understand that, where it's coming from. And, Europeans came to this meeting a bit better prepared, not ready to take a beating, kind of trying to figure out the messaging, that they want to send back, to the United States. So, so we've heard Merz, taking the lead in this, clearly as the host. But what I would wish more is that we would have a strategy, right? So what's our goal?
But how easy is it ever going to be for a body of, or if we think of the European Union, 27 countries, to make a strategy, especially when we might be a year and a bit away from a president of France who has views perhaps more in keeping with the current American administration than with any European country?
Well, I'm not talking about the strategy in a document that has to be voted by the 27 after 7 pre-meetings and pre-sessions, but more like like canny. So think of in these terms, right? So
sort of a manifesto.
A manifesto, yeah, exactly. So what is a European manifesto? What is a European version of transatlantic relationship? That is the question that I have not had answered, through the days here in Munich. Because we've heard, Rubio's version of transatlantic relations, which is based not on values anymore, but based on the civilizational, history and interests. So then we are left either to accept it as Europeans, because that's a blueprint, or we have to offer our version of it, right? So it can be Merz, it can be Macron, it can be anyone, right? It can be a think tank, it can be Ischinger, just suggesting, look, we get where you are, this is where we are.
What did you make of Rubio's speech, though? And I guess what did you also make of Rubio's presence as opposed to that of Vice President Vance? Because it is usual that the US Vice President comes to Munich.
Well, my thinking is that, the signs of rupture probably rang some bells in Washington, and maybe it's going a bit too fast. And
rupture between
the
Europe and the US.
Yeah. The stuff that Carney, again, mentioned, it's stuck with everyone, and that's a notion. Even if you travel through Munich, you see all those, signs, Europe is getting ready, Europe, we can do it. and it tells you that, Europeans probably are not planning to purchase F-35s in the numbers that they could have. And that's a real problem, right? I think that, if there is one thing, U.S. intended to have their hands on European defense spending. And clearly that is not happening, or not at least in the numbers that they would have expected. So what do you do then, right? You try to, as I say, put some white paint on the ruptures.
Is there a danger, though, that if people feel a bit reassured by what Rubio said, or perhaps didn't say yesterday, that they now feel perhaps too reassured, that there might be a temptation to lapse back into, it'll all be fine? Yeah,
there could be that, clearly. And I heard in the halls, people saying, it's much better. Then I asked, so what's better? And we were not kicked directly in the teeth. That was, so that's the bar that we set up for ourselves. We have to admit that the reality is different. The United States now is basing its vision of the world based on their interest. And if our interests diverge, as for example when it comes to Ukraine and the security of Europe, then we have to have our own plan. And our own, without waiting for what's coming from the United States. And actually, that is one indication. Rubio did not mention Ukraine.
That does seem fairly extraordinary, though, that the United States Secretary of State didn't even address that directly.
Yeah, because that is not in their interest.
Are you reassured, less reassured, whatever, by what you have or haven't heard about Ukraine this weekend?
Well, one thing that kind of, I'm usually very gloomy during Munich, but this time,
we've noticed.
Yeah, thank you. I've been trying hard to get the message across. But one thing that we're standing just outside the Ukrainian house, which is just by the main venue of the conference. So I was really worried that almost the 50th year of the war starting, we would not have Ukraine present, and we do. And it's still everywhere. I participated in the panels with Ukrainians, and we talk about Ukraine. There's Ukrainian lunch and Ukrainian dinner. So it's still very much a topic for Europeans, and I'm glad that it is.
But does it strike you that we are anywhere nearer now than at any point in the last 4 years to some kind of ending to the conflict in Ukraine as we've come to know it? Or do you subscribe to the view that it's not going to end because Russia has no interest in it ending?
I don't think that Russia has an interest in ending it. Russia doesn't see us creating a leverage enough for them to be persuaded that they need this to end. I don't think that 90 billion, even though that's a significant sum for Ukrainians that Europeans have promised, that this is going to reassure Russians, that this is for long term. They still believe that cracks within our societies, within our, between the countries, that they will force us to limit the, defense spending, limit the support to Ukraine, and this is what they're betting on.
But just finally then, do you think that an actual military victory for Ukraine is something that is still possible, and if it is possible, if it's something that should be pursued?
I think that both sides, meaning Ukraine and Russia, are expecting other side to collapse.
Yeah.
So basically, we should not be looking at at the meters of the front movement, or tiny village being taken on one or the other side. But basically, it's whether we are closer to each side's collapse. Ukrainians are thinking that Russian economy will just, will not hold any longer, and Russians are hoping that Ukrainian people will not hold any longer, just because. And this is why they're attacking the civilian objects during the winter.
Which is a horrible high-stakes standoff. But which of those two things do you expect would crack first?
Well, I frown a little bit when somebody says that they know.
That was Gabrielius Landsbergis, former Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. The 2022 Munich Security Conference was famously the last time Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was seen in public wearing a suit and tie. Days after he and the Ukrainian delegation returned home that year, Russia launched against their country the largest land war in Europe since World War II. The prospect, or otherwise, of peace in Ukraine were inevitably a theme of Munich 2026. Amid the hurly-burly of the mezzanine of the Bayerischer Hof, I spoke to Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations during President Donald Trump's first term, previously U.S. Ambassador to NATO under President George W. Bush. I began by asking if, where Ukraine is concerned, the US and Europe now want fundamentally different outcomes.
No, I wouldn't say that, but I think we have fundamentally some different approaches here. And when you talk about outcomes, let's define it. We want to see a sovereign, independent, secure European Ukraine. And we want to see Europe do as much as possible to bring that about. We want to see Ukraine included in the European Union. We want to have an end to the war and not a resumption of the war. We want to deter future attacks. So I think those are shared goals. Now, what we've seen, however, over the past year...
You didn't mention there was Ukraine in NATO. Do you think there's a split on that?
I don't, because I don't see Europe or European NATO members pushing for this right now.
Okay.
The U.S. is clearly not in favor of Ukrainian NATO membership now. I think we've been able to avoid definitive statements about never. So we kind of have parked this. And if you were to have a NATO discussion about Ukrainian NATO membership today, it would not only be the United States, there would be several European allies as well that said, no, not now. So what we are talking about, and this is a shared conversation, is security assurances for Ukraine, which would involve Europe and the United States, European allies and the US. There would be a coalition of the willing force deployed in Ukraine, and that force would have U.S. backup, both in terms of air power and in terms of in extremis and enablers if necessary, for such as satellites and information. So there is a coordinated plan there.
But do you perceive any, I guess, especially given recent events over Greenland in particular, any mistrust among Europeans and perhaps even among Ukrainians as to what the US security guarantee during this administration is going to be worth? Like, would the Americans actually turn up if they were needed?
You had President Trump repeatedly saying that he wants to annex Greenland, he wants to take it over, and even refusing to take the use of force off the table when it comes to annexing Greenland. Well, this is a predatory approach, not the action of an ally, and it left a very deep divide between the U.S. and Europe, and as you said, within Europe, a real lack of trust in the United States. We don't know what the U.S. is going to do. But at the same time, that approach has been now put back into a negotiation. It is really only President Trump, which matters. It is President Trump, but it's not the whole administration, it's not the Congress, not the American people. You look at the opinion polls, nobody wants to take over Greenland. You had a lot of pushback from Republicans in the Congress and the Senate. You had pushback from Democrats in the media. So the U.S. is not seriously pursuing this annexation of Greenland. And I think what we need now is to get this into a constructive negotiation. Right now, it seems like people are still meeting but not talking. And I think we need to get the substance down a little bit better. As for Ukraine, however, where this has gone is in a slightly different position. You had the U.S. parroting Russian proposals with this 28-point plan. That was then negotiated with Rubio, Kushner, Witkoff, with the Ukrainians and with European allies, turned into a 20-point plan that is much more reasonable There are still a few areas of disagreement, particularly concerning territory. But this is now something where the US, Europe, and Ukraine are in alignment. And it really exposes what the big gap in all of this is that Russia is refusing to end the war. We have not made any progress in this first year of President Trump's term, or in the last 4 years. We've not made any progress whatsoever in convincing Putin that he has to end the war.
But as somebody who's seen this crisis up close, do you perceive at this point that there's any prospect of, short of literally running out of tanks, bullets, and human beings, of Putin ending this war? Because there's no incentive for him to do that.
Yeah, there are two things that are pressing on Putin already, and we have to increase that pressure. The first one is the mathematics of the military challenge. The Ukrainians are able to take more Russian soldiers off the battlefield every month than Russia is able to put onto the battlefield. This can't go on forever. So this is already a gap in Russia's military effort. Now, they can continue this for a long time, but they are not making any real gains on the ground. They are bombing Ukrainian cities a few times a week at night, hitting the electricity grid, but they are not making a strategic difference in the war. So this is one that we have to keep the pressure on and make it militarily more and more useless for Russia. The second thing we have to do is go after the finances. That Russia still gets money for oil and gas, including from Europe, including from China and India, and that money is going into the Kremlin to fund the war effort. So if we can stress those finances more through secondary sanctions, through Europe shutting down any further oil and gas imports and doing it sooner rather than 2027, those are all things that we should be doing as well.
Do you have any thoughts on what a plausible settlement, for want of a better word, in Ukraine could look like? Could it be some sort of, I don't know, East-West Germany thing or Cyprus, Northern Cyprus thing, where one side says we don't regard this as permanent and the other side says we don't regard this as temporary?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going to happen eventually. I don't think Putin will ever succeed in taking over all of Ukraine or defeating Ukraine. I don't think Ukraine will defeat Russian military forces and reconquer its territory in any near term. So we end up with a de facto situation of Russian occupation of part of Ukraine, a ceasefire, and deterrence against future Russian attacks. I don't think there'll ever be a peace agreement that Putin would agree to, because he wants everything. He wants all of Ukraine. He wants to restrict NATO. He wants to restrict the Ukrainian military. He wants to roll back past NATO enlargement. None of this is going to happen. So we end up, just as you said, a East-West Germany situation or a North and South Korea situation where there is a de facto ceasefire. We try to deepen it and make it permanent, but we live with that for a long time.
But for nearly 4 years now, as I'm sure you've heard, the Ukrainians have been saying, we can win this war, just give us the equipment and we can do it. Do you think that is or was ever true?
I think there are different phases of this.
Yeah.
I think if we go back to early 22, when the Russians first attacked and they all stalled out on the roads, that was the time to really give the Ukrainians everything, and they could have pushed the Russians back out completely. I think that is something they could have done then. The second phase was before the Russians put in all of these defensive lines, and the Ukrainians tried a counteroffensive, but the Russians had time to build all of these defensive lines in southern and eastern Ukraine. So the Ukrainians were not really able to materially advance in their counteroffensive. And that's because we held back on all kinds of weapon systems that we could have given Ukraine at the time and didn't. Now we're in a different situation where Russia is dug in, very difficult for Ukraine to advance now, and we are still holding back on certain weapons. I think what is achievable more realistically is giving Ukraine the ability to hit targets at very long range inside Russia, missile factories, drone factories, airfields, so that the Russians have a harder and harder time putting any pain on Ukraine. That, I think, is one of the factors that would contribute to Putin agreeing to a ceasefire, and I think that's where we realistically end up. Whether Ukraine could retake all of the territory with a hypothetical unlimited range and type of equipment, possibly, but I'm not sure.
That is just sounds like at this point like an astonishing missed opportunity, doesn't it?
It does. Oh, we blew this so many times. I just have to tell you that we could have done so much more, so much sooner, and we self-deterred.
That was Kurt Volker, former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and former US Ambassador to NATO. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. US President Donald Trump's threats against Greenland and dismissal of the contributions made by US allies to operations in Afghanistan and Iraq elicited genuine and proper anger among those European countries which still prefer to think of themselves as America's friends. Also in the Bayerischer Hof, I spoke to the British MP Tom Tugendhat, former Minister of State for Security and a veteran himself of Afghanistan and Iraq. I began by asking him if this Munich Security Conference felt more like the typical transatlantic mutual backslap than last year's.
The conversation has never been more important because, let's be honest, the last year has been difficult. It has raised many questions and many challenges, and although Mark Rutte has done very well to smooth things over, there's a lot of people who are wondering what exactly the last year has meant for them. 4 pillars, as it were, of European security have been: America's always there, defence can wait, the reality is that we can time our decisions, and that we can not focus too much on Europe together. Now, I would suggest that all 4 of those are wrong.
They are now, certainly, but have you got any sense yet of the damage that has been done, even at kind of a visceral, personal level, to that alliance by the events of just of recent weeks, when we've had the United States threatening to invade Denmark, the President of the United States denigrating the soldiers of its allies, of which you were one in Iraq and Afghanistan. Are people managing to see past that?
It's hard to overstate quite how offensive the denigration of the loss of our friends, and for me, my friends, was. I mean, it was deeply offensive, and I know Danish friends who lost 60, 70 friends feel exactly the same. But I think there's many of us who also see beyond that and realise that actually the United States is and has been a partner to Europe, not actually out of choice, but out of necessity to both of us. We are both each other's only real strategic partner when you look at the depth of cooperation, the depth of political systems, and the depth of human interaction. It really is that close.
But does Europe need to be able to trust the United States in the same way for the relationship to function the same way?
Well, one of the wonderful things about the US, which is less so about some of our other allies, is that the government isn't the be-all and end-all of the relationship. You know, the different states have different authorities, and the private sector, business, think tanks and so on, have different areas of influence as well, less under government control, if you like, than would be the case in other states. And so, you know, the relationship is both very, very deep and very, very close, and occasionally a bit fractious. So
what have you made, then, of Sir Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister's efforts to keep what Britain is pleased to call the special relationship ongoing?
Well, I'm always struck, actually, it's the Americans who refer to it as a special relationship, almost like a sop, it somehow feels. Look, I think, to be fair to the Prime Minister, that's something he's done well. He's maintained the relationship with the President of the United States. And, you know, it is one of the jobs of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to maintain that relationship. It's an unconditional element of the position of living in number 10. I have many more criticisms of things like his bizarre visit to Beijing, where he asked for and got absolutely nothing. But his relationship with the United States has been a good example of success.
Just thinking ahead to the next couple of days, because we are speaking early at the Munich Security Conference, do you expect, again, Ukraine to dominate this one? And if not, would you actually kind of like Ukraine to dominate this one?
Well, in a couple of hours' time, I'll be unveiling an Iranian drone brought over here by United Against a Nuclear Iran, an organisation of which I'm a patron. Because that drone, made in Iran, fired by Russia, shot down over Ukraine and then cleaned up by Poland and brought here by me, amongst others, is an example of the interconnectedness of these things. Because the US fleet is getting ready, we got to assume, for some sort of action in Iran. And a lot of the things that they will be facing is the kind of unmanned aerial vehicles, the kind of drones the Russians have been firing at the Ukrainians and killing so many people in cities across the country. So that connection, I think, is what we really need to remember. Ukraine isn't just about Ukraine. Ukraine is about supply chains. Ukraine is about Axis powers sort of aligning themselves against the United States, against the free world, against Europe. And it's about that threat that Europe really feels immediately, but the US isn't exactly divorced from.
But as we're coming up to the 4th anniversary of the full-scale war in Ukraine, and that is 4 years of just extraordinary and barely imaginable sacrifice by the Ukrainians, do you still feel like that a conclusive decision has not been made by Ukraine's European allies about how they actually want this war to turn out? I mean, this is a refrain I know you've heard before, and I think we spoke about this in Odessa last year, that Ukraine's frustration that we're being given enough to continue but not enough to win.
Yeah, look, this is a huge frustration for me, and one of the reasons I was critical of funnily enough, of the Conservative administration, and have since been critical of other European administrations over recent years. We should be making sure that we are putting the Ukrainians in a place to win, because actually the worst of all possible worlds is a fair fight. A fair fight is where everybody loses. You need to have an unfair fight so that the winner knows they've won and the loser knows they've lost. And that actually is how you save lives. And instead what we're seeing, as you rightly say, that drip feed, which is too limited to actually turn the tides. Now, the extraordinary courage and determination of the Ukrainian people is remarkable and something to be hugely admired. But our job is to make sure that they have a choice. That doesn't mean that they have a choice of going all the way to Moscow or anything like that. It's a choice of getting themselves to a position of having a serious negotiated peace in some way. Now, whether that negotiation includes Crimea or not, that's up to them, but some sort of a negotiation.
But just finally then, how big a hazard do you think, because this will definitely come up this weekend, is a kind of peace at any price, a peace imposed on Ukraine by a Europe and especially the United States that just wants the war to stop and doesn't really care all that much about what consequences that might store up 5, 10, 15 years down the track?
So I don't buy that. And the reason I don't buy that is because I see no interest in Moscow for a peace.
Yeah.
Right. I see absolutely no interest for Putin and his cabal for a peace. And yet, the only thing that's going for them is if they can get a peace on these lines. Actually, they have failed so dramatically in Ukraine. It's extraordinary. I mean, if you look at the change between 21 and today, I think the expansion, I think they've taken about 3% of Ukrainian territory to the cost of something like 1 million killed and injured. I mean, it's absolutely horrific what Putin has done to the Russian people. But of course, he knows that within his own system, he would be the first Russian leader to have failed to take Kiev. He would be the first Russian leader who has not pushed what he describes, and it's completely untrue, but what he describes as an evil power on his western border away from Russia. He would be the first Russian leader to have completely and utterly, miserably failed in a military conquest of Ukraine, and yet that's exactly what's happening. So he can't end the war, and he knows he can't end the war. What's interesting is oil prices are coming down. The economy in Russia is struggling very, very badly. And even without the United States support as it was, the Europeans are replacing so much of the money and weaponry that the Ukrainians need.
That was Tom Tugendhat, MP, speaking to us at the Munich Security Conference. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Finland has, for obvious reasons, always taken its defence seriously and generally preferred to look after itself. But after Russia attacked Ukraine, Finland, along with Sweden, joined NATO, one presumable benefit of which was closer defence cooperation with the United States. Outside the Bayerischer Hof, I spoke to Finnish Defence Minister Antti Hakanen. I asked if the Greenland scare had given him any reason to reconsider the relationship.
Well, of course, there's a lot of hard talk now, and the Greenland case was quite serious. But still, there has been a lot of talks now during the last 3 or 4 weeks, and we think that things are getting smoother and smoother. The talks between Pentagon and the White House, we think that the process is going to the right track now.
Was it especially discomforting for a country which took delivery of its first F-35 in December? You've got 63 more on the way. Any concerns at all that you're over-invested in this relationship at this point?
Well, the U.S. industry is a key player to provide the world's best equipment against potentially Russian and Chinese military equipment. So we're neighboring Russia. We have to have the best equipment. So we don't have any kind of options because in Europe, the industry doesn't produce that kind of high-tech equipments. And what comes to the dependency, we still rely that the United States as a government, but also as an industry, they think these are long-term commitments. And what comes to equipment, Finnish model is that we are building in certain equipments a lot of security supply for our own. At this point, European industry cannot produce certain equipments, especially in the air defense, surveillance, critical technologies in certain other areas. So we don't have plan B. Until the European industry can produce. But that will take a little bit of time.
That will take time. When you talk about Finland's own production, is that something you're anticipating furnishing landmines? Finland obviously has now withdrawn from the Ottawa Convention. Do you have any ideas yet about how big a deployment of landmines you're going to be laying? How much of Finland will become, I guess, more or less uninhabitable and unworkable?
First of all, the anti-personnel mines, they are really cost-effective way to defend wide land areas. And we have land border with Russia, 1,300 kilometers.
Yeah.
I know that this is not a big case for countries which don't have land border with Russia.
I know Finland's not the only country which has made this decision.
Yeah, so that's why the land mining in anti-personnel mines and anti-tank mines, that's the cost-effective way for a small country, small nation, to protect big area of our country. We will produce them in Finland with some company, and we are now assessing that what company could produce them. And we are not using the mines unless someone attacks to Finland. So we are really secure, and we have a lot of expertise in mining. For example, we are marking every mine in digital maps. My reservist position in Reservist Army is a platoon leader in the mining company, so I know the stuff. That's why we are secure. We know the stuff. We can take them off because they are in the digital maps, the mines. But we are not using them during the peacetime, only if someone attacks to Finland.
But don't they have to be laid in advance? Are they not a preemptive defense?
No.
You would only start laying them in the event of actual attack on Finland?
You can put mines in a couple of hours.
Okay.
And that's why only if someone starts military attack. And I think this is one big kind of a miscalculation of this case, that someone thinks that during peacetime we will put mines into the ground. No, we are not putting any mines.
So when people think of, I guess, some sort of Finnish equivalent of the demilitarized zone in Korea, that's not what you're planning?
No. We think that after the Ukrainian war, eastern part of Finland is just totally normally European Union NATO membership area. There's a universities, people live there, there's businesses, there's no any mines. And only if someone starts military conflict, we will start full defense, and the mines are part of that.
Is that still what you see as the principal threat to Finland, though, a land-based assault from Russia? Do you think
No, we need all the domains. We need space, cyber, air, navy, land. But the Russian military thinking throughout the Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, is land grabbing.
Yeah.
And their land forces are... That's why Russian military is land heavy. US military is navy and air force heavy because of their geostrategic position. Russia is at the Asian continent, Eurasian continent. They are land grabbing military, like we see in Ukraine. They want land, and they are supporting it with heavy air bombing and all the stuff. And we have get used to that for hundreds of years. So that's why this protection of land at all cost is our key point of our military deterrence.
But just finally then, because it's something we've noticed travelling to a lot of these conferences over the last 4 years, that obviously those countries such as yours, which have either a land border with Russia or are very close to Russia, think about the threat much more differently, much more seriously than, say, Portugal or Spain might. Do you still see a disconnect there? Is there a kind of thought that the Nordic countries might have to look after themselves if nobody else will? I was wondering this especially in the context of the recent agreement about increased cooperation between air forces.
I think that during this week we had EU ministerial meeting and NATO ministerial meeting, and there was a wide solidarity between all the European members and almost everyone are seeing the Russian threat similarly. But I think that what the challenge comes to the politicians, for ministers, is how to speak to your voters and citizens, for example, in Western Europe, that why Russia is a threat for whole Europe. You know, if Russia starts something against European Union country member, European Union member or NATO member, there will be a full chaos again in economy, in security, and that will affect to everyone in Portugal, everyone in Spain. And in worst case scenario, Russia has capabilities to affect also the Western Europe, in worst case scenario. But in future, there can be other threats, what we cannot anticipate. And then when the West Europe or Southern Europe says that, hey, now there's threats, we will take it seriously. And that's why we hope, neighboring Russia, that you will take serious also the Russian threat now. Because we have to be united. That's the only case. And we noticed that during this political turbulence last month, that united Europe can be strong. In tariffs, in security, defense, we can be strong, but it needs unity.
That was Antti Häkkänen, Finnish Defence Minister, speaking to the Foreign Desk at the Munich Security Conference. This is the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. As a defensive alliance, NATO's whole thing is supposed to be preparing for anything. It was probably not all that prepared, however, for the possibility of one member attacking another, as the US threatened to do to Denmark earlier this year in order to seize Greenland. In a suite in Ukraine House, we spoke to Benedetta Berti, Secretary-General of NATO's Parliamentary Assembly. I began by asking how rattled the alliance had been by the prospect of conflict over Greenland.
I think that is a fair characterization. I think now we are in a place where there is a constructive dialogue, where there is a shared sense of urgency by all NATO countries about the importance of strengthening NATO posture in the High North. There is a clear recognition of the strategic importance of the High North for deterrence and defense, including of the strategic position of Greenland. And just a couple of days ago, at the NATO Defense Ministerial, of course, there was the announcement that NATO presence will increase with this Arctic Sentry activity. There is a common goal here to ensure that we have a strong deterrence and defense posture and that China and Russia never gain a foothold militarily or economically in Greenland.
But just going back to the previous few weeks, in your long experience of NATO, had there ever been any serious conversation about what do we do if two NATO members actually come to blows with each other?
So I have to say that over 76 years of history in NATO, a lot of different occurrences have happened, have presented themselves. So as an alliance, we're pretty elastic. We're pretty able to react to different contingencies, to crises, to sometimes very acrimonious disagreements between our members. So that is certainly not, disagreement between members are not exceptional. They do occur throughout the history of NATO. And without going too much into details, of course, as an alliance, we always think about all different types of plans and contingencies.
But certainly just in the short time we've been here already at this conference, because we're just about, as we talk, at lunchtime on day one, have spoken to a few people from various NATO countries, and these are European NATO countries, sort of suggesting that there's kind of different tracks and different factions emerging within NATO, that because you can't now rely on the United States to turn up if NATO is actually tested. Does that necessarily weaken NATO, though? Might it be necessarily a bad thing if there is a twin track or triple track or a coalition of the willing to do this or that emerging within NATO?
Maybe I'll rephrase it a little bit, and I can just tell you how I see it. And how I see it is, and I believe we've talked about this in the past, because the security environment is structurally different, the division of labor between NATO countries, is particularly between North America and Europe, has been changing. And the way forward, and we've been talking about this for years, is really about European allies and Canada in NATO taking the lead, particularly for the conventional deterrence and defense of Europe. So more capabilities, more forces, more responsibilities, including at leadership level. To me, that does not mean that NATO is without the United States or without a committed U.S. ally, but it is changing, and it is ultimately moving towards a European-led NATO with a strong U.S. commitment. And that's the way I see it. More than a rupture, an evolution that is dictated by a much changing security environment, and also an opportunity for Europeans to ultimately have more agency, responsibility for our own continent. So I think there is actually a quite positive way forward, provided we spend more money, we get our armed forces in order, we invest in more capability, and we strengthen our defense industrial base. All things that we are doing more of.
But what you do get to see up close is the difference, I'm assuming at least, is the difference in attitude still among those European NATO countries. Because if I've heard this time and again, I'm sure you have, this frustration from countries closer to Russia, that they see how serious the threat is, whereas those countries further west are still seeming to think, it's all the way over there, it's not really our problem. Does that tension still exist, do you think, among NATO's European partners?
I think it's clear that when it comes to threat perception, geography matters,
Sure.
History matters, a number of different domestic factors matter. So I think you are right that the closer you get to the front line, quote unquote, the stronger the sense of urgency. At the same time, and this is something the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is very much doing, we are also highlighting that we need to look a little bit beyond geographical, quote unquote, front lines, because daily sabotage of our critical infrastructure, attacks on our undersea cables, cyber attacks. When we put it all together, it is really hard to argue that it's not the whole of NATO that is being tested and probed. So we really are having a very deliberate conversation about moving beyond this East versus South or division of threat perception conversation, because we think the reality is that we're kind of all on the eastern flank, like Secretary General Rutte says. So we're very much working to have a much more nuanced perception of the challenges and threat we face.
Just finally, is it almost more challenging for an organization like NATO if Russia doesn't test it in an overt and obvious way, like, for example, biting a chunk off Estonia or Latvia or the various other nightmare scenarios that people talk about, but just continues to do that kind of thing you're talking about, the probing, the annoyance, the hybrid stuff, the deniable stuff, because that allows those NATO countries who don't want to believe this is really happening to carry on pretending it's really not happening?
I would say that as of 2020, as we're speaking now, February 2026, there is a shared sense between all allies that we need to take our security environment extremely seriously, including because of the threat posed by Russia. So I think there is that sense of common purpose. There may be different nuances. But you're absolutely right that NATO's conventional deterrence posture, nuclear deterrence posture is strong, is solid, and that's a good thing, and we want to keep it that way. But that does not mean that hybrid attacks, the so-called below-the-threshold attacks, are not something we need to be taken extremely seriously. And here, the work we're doing is very much focused on, one, building more resilience, because as you become stronger against attacks, it's harder to find your vulnerabilities, which is ultimately what our adversaries are trying to do. And the second track is, how do you also impose costs on the adversary? In this case, how do you impose what we call strategic dilemmas? How do you use instruments like economic sanctions or political pressure to make sure that there is a price paid for these attacks? There are conversations on these issues at NATO, and I think those are really important to make sure that we don't, quote unquote, boil the frog and become used to this new normal of hybrid attacks, because we should really not. They are a serious threat to our security.
That was Benedetta Berti, Secretary General of NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, speaking to us at the 2026 Munich Security Conference. And that's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week with more from the Munich Security Conference, and look out for the Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces the Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mullett, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.